Frida Kahlo is the most expensive female artist in history. Imagine Mexico City, April 1953, the artist's first exhibition just a year before her death. Doctors forbade her to get up because she had developed gangrene in one leg. And then she orders them to bring her straight to the exhibition, right in her bed. Hello everyone, Nina Shev here, and today we have Frida Kahlo herself. I've been waiting for the chance to tell you about this extraordinary artist and her incredibly vibrant life. Let's go. Let's start with the house. It still stands today at the corner of Londres and Allende streets in Coyoacan, which was then a quiet suburb of Mexico City and now is a neighborhood within the expanded city. The house's walls were bright blue with green shutters on the windows. Mexicans call it Casa Azul, the blue house. Frida Kahlo was born here on July 6, 1907, and she would die here as well, in this very bedroom, almost 47 years later. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a photographer of German, Jewish, and Hungarian descent who came to Mexico at the age of 19. Her mother, Matilde Calderon, was a Mexican woman of half indigenous, half Spanish descent from Oaxaca. He and Matilde had 4 daughters: Matilde, Adriana, Frida, and Cristina. He would never have a son, and that's an important detail. We'll come back to it later. Now let's talk about Mexico in those times. In 1910, Mexico had been ruled single-handedly for almost 30 years by the dictator Porfirio Diaz. In 1910, a rebellion broke out. In the north, the armies of Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco rose up. In the south, there was the peasant army of Emiliano Zapata. Diaz fell a year later, in 1911, and then there would be almost 10 years of nearly continuous civil war. And only in 1920, with the rise to power of President Obregón, did the country more or less calm down. For Frida's parents, the revolution wasn't a celebration of freedom, but a personal tragedy. Guillermo Kahlo earned a good living from government contracts under Diaz. The Blue House was built with this money. When Diaz's government fell, the commissions dried up. 10 years of civil war nearly ruined the family completely. They mortgaged the house, sold the furniture, and took in lodgers. Her mother deserves separate mention. Matilda was a religious fanatic. She took her daughters to church every day and prepared them for their first communion. Frida and her sister Cristina openly made fun of this. They exchanged glances during prayer, trying not to laugh, avoided catechism classes, and picked fruit from the neighbors' gardens. And at the age of 6, something happened that determined Frida's entire physical fate: poliomyelitis. She didn't leave her room for 9 months. The illness left her right leg thinner than her left for the rest of her life. The children in the yard teased her. They called her Wooden Leg Frida, and she furiously responded with curses. To hide the thinness of her leg, she wore 3 or 4 pairs of socks at once and shoes with a built-up heel. Her father, who was exceptionally gentle with his daughter during her illness, insisted that Frida play sports. At that time, it was almost scandalous for a Mexican girl. Soccer, boxing, swimming, rowing, cycling, these were activities only boys did. I had the same toys as the boys, she recalled. In Mexican families, it was very important to have a son. Inheritance was passed down through the male line, and her father chose young Frida as a substitute for a son. He began bringing her to his studio, teaching her photo development and photography aesthetics, laying the foundation for the 2 key aspects of his daughter's character. First, a liberated view of gender roles. She loved wearing men's 3-piece suits. There is a famous family photo from 1926 where Frida stands among her mother and sisters in a full men's suit with a cane. This was also reflected in her self-portraits. For example, the 1940 self-portrait with cropped hair, where she explores the themes of masculinity, independence, and the rejection of the classic female role imposed by culture. Secondly, the fundamentals of visual skill, which later became the foundation of her painting. Another childhood episode, important for understanding her later painting. After suffering from polio, the lonely Frida, spending many months alone in her room, invented an imaginary friend for herself. She would breathe on the window glass, draw a door on the fogged-up glass with her finger, and go through it into her own imaginary world. Many years later, when explaining one of her most famous paintings, the double portrait, The Two Fridas, she would describe exactly this childhood experience of splitting herself in two. Notice that the theme of the double, the wounded body, and the imaginary refuge did not come from avant-garde trends or an attempt at surrealism, as people would later attribute to her, but from the lonely childhood of a sick girl in Coyoacan. Frida's school years were intertwined with post-revolutionary changes in Mexico. Friends, a small non-commercial announcement. We are launching a project to find new talented artists. There will be promotion and clear, respectful interaction. I will leave a link in the description. Here's the email address. If you're an artist, write to us and we'll talk. In 1920, José Vasconcelos, a brilliant philosopher who took part in the revolution against Diaz, was appointed Minister of Education. He launches a crusade for literacy, builds 1,000 rural schools, opens libraries, swimming pools, and open-air painting schools. And most importantly for our story, he signs contracts with artists, Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and Alfaro Siqueiros, so that they would paint the walls of public buildings with frescoes glorifying Mexican history and culture. This is how the Mexican muralist movement was born out of ordinary propaganda. The very same movement that would make Diego Rivera, Frida's future husband, the most famous artist in the country. Rivera would become the main figure of this movement, a sort of state artist of the New Mexico. To draw a modern analogy, it would be like if the government today commissioned Banksy to paint the facades of all the ministries. And it was to this school, the famous National Preparatory School, the most prestigious educational institution in Mexico, where among 2,000 students, there were only about 35 girls that 15-year-old Frida enrolled in 1922. Unlike her sisters, who simply received a traditional religious secondary education considered sufficient for any woman at the time. In 1922, when Frida enrolled there, the school had only just begun admitting women. Girls made up only about 1.7% of the total number of students. Frida was among those 35 pioneering women who dared to prepare for higher education in Mexico. Not only thanks to her intellect, she passed the most difficult entrance exams, but also thanks to her father, who supported her desire to study alongside young men as an equal. She dreamed of becoming a doctor. It was here in the school's assembly hall that she would first see Diego Rivera, then 35, painting frescoes in the school's assembly hall. Already married, already famous, working on scaffolding above the creation mural. According to legend, she told her friends that one day she would have a son with him, and this desire, this dream, would also become an important aspect of the artist's life and work. September 17, 1925, Frida is 18. She is a beautiful, lively, very active and energetic girl who doesn't know any rules, a bit of a troublemaker, a bit of a revolutionary, and a bit just a girl. She is returning home with her first crush, Alejandro Gomez, on a wooden bus, not suspecting that this routine trip will change her whole life. Next, I will quote her own story so that you can all hear it firsthand. Everything happened almost as soon as we got on the bus. At first, we wanted to take a different bus, but because I lost a small umbrella, we got off to look for it, and that's why it happened that we ended up on the bus that maimed me. The trolley bus was moving slowly, but the driver of our bus was a very nervous young man. When the trolley bus turned the corner, the bus crashed into the wall. The collision threw us forward, and the handrail that people hold onto in the bus pierced me like a sword pierces a bull. Alejandro's friend recalled even more terrifying details. The trolley bus slowly pressed into the wooden bus until it shattered into thousands of splinters. A metal handrail pierced Frida's pelvis, entering from the left side and passing through her body. The collision literally tore her clothes off. One of the passengers, possibly a painter, had a bag of powdered gold paint on the bus. The bag burst, and gold powder showered Frida's bloodied body. People around were shouting that they saw a dancer before them, all in gold and blood. "We need to get the metal out of her," someone said. When they were pulling it out, Frida's scream drowned out the siren of the arriving ambulance. In the end, there was a spinal fracture in 3 places in the lumbar region, a broken collarbone, the 3rd and 4th ribs broken, 11 fractures in the right leg, a dislocated and shattered foot, and torn ligaments in the left shoulder. "I lost my virginity," Frida would say later. "The handrail went through my groin." The doctors weren't sure she would survive, but she made it through the first critical month. And then came 9 long months in a plaster corset and almost complete immobility. For the second time in her life, Frida found herself locked in her room, only this time she was also confined to her bed. And this is where something happens that will turn tragedy into the birth of an artist. Confined to her bed, almost completely in a cast, Frida couldn't do anything except stare at the ceiling. Then her father built a special easel for her that attached directly to the bed. And above the bed, he fixed a mirror so that while lying on her back, the girl could at least see her own reflection. And Frida began to paint self-portraits, simply because the only model available to her 24 hours a day was herself. Self-portraits would become the main theme of her work. They would also become a visual diary of her difficult and turbulent life. "I paint myself," she would say later, "because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." Notice, friends, how different this is from the story of any male artist of that time, who started with the academy, teachers, models, went through all the stages of training, and learned from the experience of predecessors. Frida came to painting not through a studio or someone else's methods and approaches, but through a hospital bed, through self-discovery and self-development, through attempts to create something of her own without any examples before her eyes that she could copy. A year in bed with a brush, alone with herself, would forever define the main theme of her art. Her own wounded body, as the only canvas available to her to tell the world about herself, would at the same time shape her unique, naive, and somewhat awkward style. Exactly how Frida and Diego met again is not known for certain. The sources differ, and I won't make up a beautiful version where there isn't one. It is known that by 1928, 21-year-old Frida, already having recovered quite well after the accident, joined the League of Young Communists and began attending meetings. She stopped wearing white schoolgirl blouses and started wearing black and red shirts, pinning her hair with a hairpin shaped like a hammer and sickle. She brought her paintings to show to Diego Rivera, the very artist she'd seen on the scaffolding at the National Preparatory School, right at his workplace, on the school scaffolding. Frida's family was in a financial crisis after her illness, and the young artist didn't come for praise, but for a clear answer. Did she have talent, and could she use it to help her family? "I didn't come to ask you for compliments. I want to know if I have talent. If not, I'll find another job to earn money and help my family," she said. Frida described how Diego climbed down from the scaffolding, carefully examined the portrait of her sister Cristina, and said, "You have your own style. You should keep painting." However, according to Frida's recollections, she doubted whether he was just saying this out of politeness to a young woman, and firmly added, "Don't say this to me just to be nice. If you think this is crap, just say so." Diego assured her that he was absolutely sincere and asked her to show the rest of her works. Frida replied, "They're at home, in Coyoacan." To that, Rivera replied that he would come the very next Sunday. That's how their romance began, and that's how Frida Kahlo's journey as an artist started. Only after Rivera's words did she change her attitude toward painting from just a pastime to the meaning of her life. It was then that she decided to become a professional artist. Lupe Marin, who was Rivera's wife at the time, however, remembered Frida without any sympathy, and it's hard to blame her for that. "I was shocked by the familiarity with which this brazen young lady addressed him. She called him my big buddy. Naturally, I was jealous, but I didn't pay much attention to it, because Diego fell in love as easily as a weather vane turns in the wind." Rivera was 20 years older than Frida. He was heavyset and had already been married almost 3 times, if you count it the Mexican way, including his long-term affairs. A renowned artist, the most famous in the country. But what attracted him was precisely her directness, her openness, and that mix of straightforwardness, even boldness, and of course, her undisguised sexuality. Diego didn't try to retrain her, didn't try to impose his own style, probably at first not even believing, as was often the case, that a woman would seriously take up painting. "You need to develop your own expressiveness," he writes in his memoirs, practically presenting himself as the creator of her genius. In a way, that's how it was. Because without his approval, even if it was due to his interest in her as a woman, she wouldn't have dared to pursue the path of an artist. And that's exactly how Frida became one of the very few artists in art history who never even tried to formally study painting. However, Rivera's influence is very noticeable in Frida's early paintings. The portrait of Cristina, my sister, was painted during the period when Diego had just entered Frida's circle. Unlike European classicism, as seen in her first self-portrait in a velvet dress, here the figure of her sister is painted large, placed strictly in the center, and outlined with clear contours. The background is reduced to a simplified local color and stylized plants, rendered in flat areas of color. This technique is characteristic of traditional Mexican retablo paintings and Rivera's frescoes. The portrait of Virginia, the girl from Ñuñoa, and those of local Mexican children and women are all painted in the same style. As well as the portrait of Lupe Marin, Rivera's wife, a large sculptural silhouette against a wall stylized in the Mexican manner. Over time, the imitation or even idolization of Rivera will pass. Frida will begin to shape space in her own way. Where Rivera generalized and theorized, she clung to specific details. The child's large ears, bony shoulders, a safety pin on a poor dress. Her mature style will be defined by meticulous attention to particulars rather than generalities. On August 21, 1929, they got married in the Old Town Hall of Coyoacan. Frida's mother was strongly opposed, an unattractive, overweight, 42-year-old communist and atheist. Not what she wanted for her daughter. Frida herself recalled this with her trademark irony. When I was 20, I fell in love with Diego, and my parents didn't like it because Diego was a communist, and because they said he looked like a fat Bruegel. They said it was like a marriage between an elephant and a dove. My mother absolutely refused to go to the wedding, and according to Mexican tradition, it was the mother who was responsible for preparing the bride's wedding dress. So Frida had to improvise, and she borrowed a maid's blouse, a shawl, and a long skirt that hid the metal brace on her leg. This was Frida's first step toward rejecting European clothing in favor of traditional Mexican Tijuana outfits. Diego adored Mexican folklore and indigenous culture. By wearing the clothes of an indigenous woman, Frida challenged the values of her mother, who was proud of her Spanish roots and strict Catholic upbringing. And at the same time, she took a step toward Diego, or even toward Diego's world, to which she had long wanted to belong. Before the wedding, Diego came to ask Frida's father for her hand, and he told him, "You understand that my daughter is a sick person and will remain sick for her whole life. She is smart, but she is a cripple. If you still want to marry her, I give my consent, but you must not forget this." And Rivera replied, "I know." After that, Frida's father added another pragmatic detail, which explains why he so easily gave his daughter to a communist and a troublemaker, and also what a little devil Frida herself was. "Frida is a devil," he said, "but she is a devil with brains. She has only one physical flaw. She is ill. You are rich, and I am poor and in debt. At least you will be able to pay for her doctors." The witnesses at the ceremony were a passing barber and a homeopathic doctor. At the wedding party, Diego's ex-wife, Frida P. Marin, caused a scene. This tall, hot-tempered Mexican woman showed up at the wedding, walked up to Frida in the middle of the feast, lifted her skirt and shouted to everyone, "Do you see these sticks? These are the legs that Diego gets now instead of mine." After that, she left proudly. Frida reacted calmly, just straightened her skirts and made a joke, but now these sticks hold Diego much better. That evening, Diego got drunk, drew a pistol, and broke someone's pinky. Here, friends, is a picture of that marriage between the elephant and the dove, and from the very start, there was far more drama than romance. And now, an important conversation about the place of women in Mexican society at that time, and how Frida responded to it with one specific gesture, her costume. Mexico in the 1920s and 1930s was a deeply patriarchal society, where the ideal of a woman was considered to be Marianismo. Piety, submissiveness, self-sacrifice for the family in the image of the Virgin Mary, like Frida's mother and her three sisters. Mexican women couldn't vote in those years. They would only gain the right to vote in 1953 at the very end of Frida's life. Can you imagine, just 80 years ago, women in Mexico gained the right to vote? Even in the world of art, which considered itself revolutionary and progressive, men were in charge. And in fact, that's how it was until very recently. The muralist movement was an exclusively male club, where a woman at best could be a model or the wife of a genius, adorning his illustrious image. And then Frida bursts into this world with her spontaneity, boldness, and directness. At first, of course, as the wife of the great Diego Rivera. And she arrives with a very feminine choice about clothing, but even at first it wasn't about fashion, and soon it would become a political statement and Frida Kahlo's calling card. After the Mexican Revolution, there was a powerful rise of indigenism, feminism, and the celebration of indigenous culture in the country's intellectual and artistic circles. Diego Rivera was a passionate collector of pre-Columbian art and a promoter of folk traditions. He believed that Mexican women were making a mistake by blindly copying Parisian and American fashion, and he admired Tijuana clothing. And he convinced Frida that these clothes would highlight her unique beauty. For Frida, it was also a way to become the perfect muse for Diego and to share his cultural and political ideals. Besides, the full skirt very conveniently concealed Frida's damaged legs. The loose blouse could hide the plaster corset, and the flowers on her head and large jewelry distracted from what the clothes were concealing. The traditional costume of Tehuantepec women comes from a southern Mexican region where legend says a matriarchy once prevailed. This is still believed to this day, but in reality, women in these settlements were simply engaged in trade and managed the family finances, and inheritance was passed down through the female line. While all the leading positions, judges, chiefs, officials, and military roles, were still held by men. However, the fact that such an important asset as money was managed exclusively by women was already so unusual that it was seen and still is seen as a matriarchy. In other words, Frida chose not the outfit of a submissive señorita, but the attire of a woman who, according to Mexican folklore, controlled her own life, not money. That's how Frida Tijuana was born, the very image we now see on mugs and t-shirts, but originally it was a deliberate daily performance. I especially want to mention perhaps the most distinctive element in Frida's image, her unibrow. I spent a long time searching to see if unibrows were ever fashionable for women, but found nothing. I was curious why Frida added this element to her image, because Frida herself didn't have a unibrow, or at least not such a prominent one. She would specifically darken the hairs with a special brush and black mascara. Frida lived in an era when women were expected to have the polished European or Hollywood beauty ideal, thin, thread-like eyebrows and soft facial features. Her unibrow and the light mustache, which she also didn't hide, were acts of defiance, a manifesto of Mexican identity. At the same time, it was as if she was claiming an exclusively masculine feature for herself, making her own mark in the predominantly male world of art. Even within her marriage, Frida was never the submissive wife of a muralist. She joined the Communist Party before Diego, took part in meetings and wrote speeches. When Rivera was painting the mural Rebellion, showing her as an armed communist with a rifle, he sarcastically said, "You have the face of a dog." She immediately responded, "And you have the face of a frog." And still, I will be honest, during her lifetime, even despite her wild and independent character, Frida spent many years in Rivera's shadow. The press release for her very first solo exhibition in New York in 1938 began with the words, "Frida Kahlo, wife of Diego Rivera." Even André Breton, whom we'll talk about a bit later, couldn't resist in his enthusiastic essay about her art and described her as the life companion of her monstrous Marxist husband. True full-scale recognition of Frida as an independent artist and not just the wife of a great man would come only after her death. During her lifetime, she balanced between two roles at once: a woman who publicly asserted her right to control her own body, sexuality, and political views, and a woman whom the press primarily defined by her husband's name. In the early 1930s, Rivera received one commission after another in the United States, San Francisco, then Detroit, then New York. Frida goes with him like a dutiful wife, but she herself calls America Gringolandia, not without irony, of course. It was in Detroit in 1932 that one of the most difficult episodes of her life happened. After the accident, Frida was physically unable to give birth on her own. Her broken pelvis made it almost impossible. Nevertheless, she became pregnant and really wanted a child. Once again, I want to draw your attention to the traditions in Mexico. Only a woman who gave her husband a son could be considered as having fulfilled her duty as a wife. And Frida was a rebel, a tomboy, but at the same time a woman who loved her husband very much and dreamed of giving him a son. She was happy. Doctors in Detroit first advised abortion, but Frida wanted a child with Diego and chose to take the risk. But on July 4, 1932, in her 13th week, she had a miscarriage right in Detroit's Henry Ford Hospital. The miscarriage was accompanied by severe bleeding, and they barely managed to save her. During the first days at Henry Ford Hospital, Frida was in a state of deep shock. On top of the physical pain, she felt completely alone. She was alone in a foreign country, Diego was busy with work, and her own body had betrayed her so cruelly. While still in her hospital room, Frida asked the doctors to give her medical atlases and illustrations of embryos. The doctors initially refused, fearing for her mental health, but Diego insisted that they bring her the books. She began to meticulously sketch the anatomical details of the pelvis structure and the stages of fetal development. This was her way of rationalizing the catastrophe, turning unbearable personal pain into an object of study in order to somehow regain control over the situation. It was after this tragedy that Frida Kahlo, the artist, was finally reborn. She abandoned traditional portraits and painted the picture that I'm telling you all this in such detail for, and that is considered Frida Kahlo's most important and most poignant work. This is Henry Ford Hospital, painted in 1932. The first work in the history of art to directly depict a miscarriage. In this painting, she depicted herself naked on a blood-stained hospital bed in the middle of Detroit's industrial landscape. In her hand are red threads resembling umbilical cords leading to 6 symbolic objects, the lost son she wanted to name Diego after her husband. Pink snails are a symbol of the slow and agonizing passage of time in the hospital. An anatomical model of the female pelvis represents the reason she couldn't carry a child. The metallic mechanism represents the coldness and cruelty of hospital equipment. Orchids are a gift from Diego, symbolizing withered sexuality and love. The broken pelvic bones are the result of the accident. Diego Rivera was amazed by this work. Later in his autobiography, he wrote, "Frida began to paint a series of masterpieces that have no equal in the history of art. They expressed only her feminine essence, her suffering and endurance. The miscarriage in Detroit would ultimately shape the unique visual language of Frida Kahlo. From now on, her self-portraits would become not just depictions of her appearance, but an honest, sometimes even harsh anatomical account of her inner life, a graphic autobiography of Frida Kahlo, filled with pain and told in a way no one had done before her." But who else could tell this story if not a woman? By the way, I have a video on my channel about the first Impressionist Berthe Morisot, who fought against prejudice in late 19th century Paris in much the same way. Check it out using the link in the description. That same summer, Frida's mother passed away. Frida painted a picture dedicated to this sad event, My Nurse and I, where she weaves her own childhood and the loss of her mother into a story about birth and milk. Longing for Mexico, she wrote to her friend from New York, "New York is very nice, but despite that, I miss Mexico." Rivera, on the other hand, was convinced that the world revolution should take place right here, in an industrial country, and wanted to stay in the US longer. But Frida thought this was mostly just empty talk. And now, an episode without which it is impossible to understand the political context of Frida's life, the story of Leon Trotsky. Let me briefly recap some history. Trotsky was one of the major leaders of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the creator of the Red Army, but he lost the struggle for power to Stalin and was expelled from the USSR in 1929. After that, he wandered the world as an exile in Turkey, France, and Norway, but no country agreed to grant him permanent asylum, fearing Moscow's wrath. In 1937, it was Diego Rivera, with the support of Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas, who managed to get Mexico to accept Trotsky. But 1937 was the year when the repressions began in Russia. The brutality with which Stalin began the purges and the turn that the USSR took from communism to what was essentially authoritarianism split the world. Many countries, which had been ardent supporters of communism, a movement that had been rapidly gaining popularity around the world, were shocked and became disillusioned with it. But no one wanted to enter into conflict with Moscow. So Trotsky, who symbolized the old, untainted, true communism, equality for all, was someone many would have been glad to accept, but they did not dare. And only distant Mexico did not waver, even though Stalin had already sent assassins after him. It was decided to settle them in the Blue House together with Frida and Diego. In January 1937, Trotsky and his wife Natalia Sedova arrived in Mexico. Rivera was in the hospital at that time, so Frida herself went to the port of Tampico to meet the revolutionaries. The Blue House was turned into a real fortress with armed guards, sandbags, and boarded up windows to protect against a possible assassination attempt by NKVD agents. Trotsky, despite his age, he was 57, loved to flirt, which nowadays would be called harassment and would be immediately cancelled. He could, for example, as eyewitnesses recall, stroke a woman's knee under the table. Frida, in turn, was hurt by Diego's recent affair with her own sister, Cristina. And Diego idolized Trotsky so much that an idea of a perfect Mexican dream began to form in her mind. Trotsky, who was used to a strict revolutionary lifestyle, was instantly charmed by the lively, bold, and witty Frida. And then, as luck would have it, a language barrier also became apparent. Neither Diego nor Natalia Sedova spoke English well enough, and Trotsky didn't speak Spanish. So it turned out that Frida and Trotsky spoke in English, which Frida knew quite well. As a form of language practice, they began openly communicating in English right at the dinner table, exchanging ambiguous hints and playing this exciting game of flirting right under their spouses' noses. Trotsky would give Frida books, slipping love letters between the pages. In his notes, he called her "my love," admiring her beauty and intelligence. Frida reciprocated, although her motives, as you can imagine, were much more complicated than just being in love. The affair reached its peak when Frida invited Trotsky to her family's ranch in San Angel under the pretext of a vacation. There, they could spend time alone without arousing suspicion from Natalia Sedova and Diego. What they did there, we don't know, and honestly, we don't want to know. The affair didn't last long and ended quietly, without scandal. Trotsky preferred not to risk either his safety or his relationship with Rivera. But its trace remained in art. It was during this period, in 1937, that Frida would paint the self-portrait Chulang Chang and I, and the famous self-portrait dedicated to Lev Trotsky, the very one that would later hang in his study. On the paper that Frida is holding in her hands in this painting, it is written in Spanish, "To Lev Trotsky, with all my love, I dedicate this painting, November 7, 1937, Frida Kahlo in San Angel, Mexico." November 7 is Trotsky's birthday and at the same time the day of the October Revolution in Russia. 3 years later, in August 1940, Trotsky would be killed by an ice axe blow in his own home in Mexico City by an agent of the Soviet Secret Services. Of course, by that time he no longer lived in the Blue House, but this death cast a shadow over Frida's life as well, and she herself would be arrested for a while on suspicion of involvement in the assassination attempt. The main reason for the interrogations was that Frida personally knew the NKVD agent and killer Ramon Mercader, who operated under the name of the Canadian Jacques Mornard. They met a year earlier, in 1939 in Paris, where she was invited by the Surrealists, who never really understood her work, but more on that later. In Mexico, Frida tried to gain the trust of Trotsky's circle and built connections with the intelligentsia, including cozying up to Frida too through their old Paris connection, inviting her to lunches. When the police identified Mornar, the trail immediately pointed to Frida as well. Moreover, although in 1937 Frida and Diego were passionate Trotskyists and gave him refuge, by 1939 they had deeply fallen out with the old man. Not only because of the exposed affair with Frida, but also because of political disagreements, which I won't go into here. By 1940, Rivera and Kahlo had publicly distanced themselves from Trotsky and began once again to show loyalty to the official Soviet line and to Stalin, which gave the police a reason to look for a motive for them to eliminate their former comrade. After 2 days of intense questioning, the police became convinced that Frida did not know about Mercader's true identity or his assignment from the NKVD. Mercader only used his acquaintance with the artist and her circle as a cover for infiltration. After all charges were dropped, she was released, and the shocked and exhausted Frida immediately flew to Diego in San Francisco, where he had quickly fled as a precaution right after hearing about Trotsky's death. But let's go back a little. This was a very interesting moment in terms of understanding Frida's art. In 1938, André Breton, a French poet, ideologist, and essentially the main manager of the Surrealism brand, if we use modern terms, came to Mexico, that very movement, the one Dalí was part of. The Surrealists believed that rationalism and bourgeois morality had led humanity to the horrors of the First World War. That's why it was necessary to create a super reality, surrealism, where dreams, hallucinations, childhood fears, and repressed sexual desires, according to Freud, have the same value as everyday life, using techniques like the exquisite corpse, meditative trances, and recording dreams. In general, they were kind of Marxist occultists, very pompous and quite popular. When he saw Frida's paintings, Breton was delighted and declared that she was a surrealist. Moreover, she was a natural surrealist who emerged entirely on her own, without any influence from the Paris school. He wrote an enthusiastic, elaborate essay for the catalogue of her New York exhibition. Frida Kahlo's art is a ribbon around a bomb. Beautifully said, right? But here's what's interesting. Frida herself was not thrilled with this label. Let me explain. European surrealism was largely based on the technique of automatic writing, the idea that the artist should turn off conscious control and let images from the subconscious, dreams, fantasies, pure irrationality flow onto the canvas. At that time, Freud's ideas were very popular in Europe. Frida never painted dreams. Instead, she painted her own reality, albeit symbolically, but as literally as possible. Her injured back, her miscarriage, her surgery, her beloved animals, her own face. This was the very essence of Frida Kahlo, her creative credo, and this was her real life, her emotions, her sensations, and her pain. What seemed like a dreamlike phantasmagoria to Europeans, bloody entrails, sliced fruit, tears streaming down the cheeks of a deer with a human face, was, for Frida, a documentary chronicle of her own body. And then a man comes along and says that all of this is just Frida's fantasies, that none of it is real, completely missing the essence of her painting, devaluing that powerful palette of emotions that Frida conveyed through her art. And she replied, "I don't paint dreams, I paint my reality." The difference between I fantasize and I state a fact is exactly where Frida fundamentally disagreed with being labeled a surrealist. Nevertheless, the label stuck, and with it came recognition. The exhibition at Julian Levy's gallery in New York in 1938, Frida's very first solo exhibition, was a success. Several paintings were sold. Among the buyers was the actor Vincent, who paid $200 for each painting. The total purchase amount was $800 for 4 paintings. For 1938, the era of the Great Depression, this was a substantial amount. In today's terms, that's about $17,000 to $18,000. This was Frida's first major sale, and she was very happy about it. But Diego, who had long since been recognized, was selling paintings for $1,000, even $5,000. Even his sketches were going for $500, about the same price as Frida's finished paintings. Now the situation is exactly the opposite, but we'll talk about that later. Diego was extremely proud of his wife's achievements, and Frida, for the first time, felt that she could earn a living on her own, become independent, and soon she would make such an attempt. In 1939, Breton organized an exhibition for her in Paris. There, Pablo Picasso wrote enthusiastically about her, and even the Louvre bought one of her paintings. The painting, the frame, which is now in New York's MoMA, would become the very first work by a Mexican artist of the 20th century to be acquired by France's largest museum. You couldn't imagine a higher recognition. The Louvre bought it, though, for 1,000 francs, which at the time was only about $25. Even now, that amount would be a symbolic $600, but still, it was the Louvre. It was here in Paris that she met Trotsky's future assassin. Behind the Parisian triumph, exhaustion lingered. Frida described her disillusionment with Parisian bohemia in her letters with unusually biting words. And now I'll try to read from her famous letter to another lover, the American photographer Nicholas Murray. She criticized the Parisian bohemia up and down. There was a lot of profanity, so I'll try to censor it somehow, I don't know. You can't imagine what bastards they are. They just make me sick. They're so rotten that I can't stand them anymore. Too many so-called intellectuals and surrealists. They sit for hours in those cheap cafes, warming their butts and endlessly talking about culture, art, revolution, and never actually doing anything. The Parisian experience so turned her against pretentious European art that Frida categorically declared, "I'd rather sit on the floor and sell tortillas at the market in Toluca than have anything to do with that lousy art crowd from Paris." It was then that she finally rejected the label of surrealist, emphasizing that she didn't paint her dreams and fantasies, but her own harsh reality. In 1939, shortly after returning from Paris, Frida and Diego got divorced. The reasons on both sides were similar. Diego's constant infidelities, not just with Cristina, as his list of affairs was long, and Frida's own affairs with both men and women, because Frida was openly bisexual, which for Mexican society was quite bold. That was almost unthinkably audacious. Besides, Frida was back on her feet and could support herself, and they would live apart for a whole year. And then, in December 1940, they got married again. For the second time in San Francisco, this time under new conditions. As Frida herself said, the spouses agreed that they would be financially independent from each other and that intimacy in their marriage would no longer be required. It was a strange union for conservative Mexico. They can't live without each other, but they also can't live together under normal conditions. But I'll add something else. Frida understood that by the standards of Mexican society, she was not a complete woman, that she couldn't give her beloved everything he wanted. And I think this was the hardest choice a woman could make, to leave the one you love because it's not working out, or to stay with him and give him the freedom to get what you can't give him yourself. "Why do I call him my Diego?" she writes later in her diary. "He never was mine and never will be. He belongs to himself." The last decades of Frida's life are, above all, the story of a body that is slowly giving up. Starting from the 1940s, she undergoes endless surgeries. In just the last few years of her life, she will undergo more than 30 surgeries on her spine and leg. In 1950, she will spend almost a year in the hospital, painting her plaster corset and receiving guests right in her hospital room. At the same time, it's important to note that witnesses recall Frida in the hospital as a very different person, not just someone who suffered. She knew how to listen, joked around, threw little parties with tequila right in her room, and watched movies with her sisters and friends. We, healthy people who came to visit her, would leave feeling reassured, recalled her close friend Elena Vasquez Gomez. In 1944, Frida's spinal condition suddenly worsened. She had to undergo several complicated surgeries and then spend about 5 months in a rigid steel orthopedic corset instead of the usual plaster ones. And during this time, she painted one of her most famous works, the Broken Column. It's important to know that in Spanish, the words for spine and column are the same, la columna. And Frida uses this play on words here, developing the story around pain, which she depicts with small nails piercing her entire body while tears run down her face. Frida's chest and abdomen are cut open with a straight surgical incision, revealing a broken column, the spine. It's held in place only by a medical corset made of white straps. It serves both as a support and as a torture device, restraining her body. In 1946, Frida went to New York for a complex surgery called spondylodesis, a surgical fusion of the vertebrae using metal brackets and a bone graft. She had high hopes for this surgery, expecting to get rid of the constant pain. However, the operation was unsuccessful. After returning to Mexico, Frida realized that the surgery not only didn't help, but also caused new complications. And she paints another famous picture, The Wounded Deer, in which she portrays herself as a deer. After painting this picture, she gave it to her close friends Arkady and Lena Beutler as a wedding gift, attaching a note, "I leave you my portrait so that my presence will be with you every day." The model for the deer was her pet deer named Graniza, who lived with her in the Blue House. The presence of the large deer antlers is not a coincidence. It points to the androgynous nature of her ego. 9 arrows are lodged in the deer's body. In the Aztec calendar and mythology, the deer is a symbol of earthly life and cycles, and the number 9 represents the underworld. In addition, there are 9 trees visible in the background. At the deer's feet lies a broken dry branch with green leaves. In Mexican tradition, a broken branch placed in front of an animal is often used in burial rituals. It is a sign of a life cut short, of unfulfilled hopes, and of farewell. In the lower left corner, next to Frida's signature, is the word karma. Even then, she was beginning to perceive her unending suffering as an inevitable karmic fate that she was destined to bear until the end. The comic deer is a self-portrait, a metaphor for a hunted animal. Frida feels like fate's target, with each arrow representing another surgery, betrayal, or physical injury. And in 1953, there will be that very solo exhibition with a bed in the middle of the gallery, the one I began this story with. Frida Kahlo's first solo exhibition, and in a way, her final act of triumph before the decline. It was organized by Frida's close friend, the photographer Laura Alvarez Bravo. The 45-year-old Frida, who was constantly on strong painkillers due to the onset of gangrene in the same leg that had been affected by polio in childhood, was strictly forbidden by doctors to get out of bed. But Frida said, "I want to be there. If the doctors don't allow me to sit, I'll come lying down." At 7:30 p.m., a few hours before the exhibition hall opened, a truck pulled up to the gallery. Workers unloaded Frida's massive 4-poster wooden bed from the truck, complete with mattress, pillows, and a mirror above it. The bed was placed right in the center of the main hall. At 8 p.m., an ambulance arrived with its siren blaring, escorted by a group of motorcyclists. Frida Kahlo was carried into the gallery on a stretcher and carefully transferred onto her own bed. From 8:15 p.m. until midnight, Frida was present at the exhibition. She was dressed in her best traditional Tehuana outfit, her hair adorned with fresh flowers and bright ribbons, and her fingers sparkled with large rings. She lay in the middle of the hall, surrounded by hundreds of guests, artists, politicians, the Mexican bohemian crowd, and the foreign press. Frida turned the opening into a vibrant celebration of life. She joked, drank tequila, and sang her favorite Mexican folk songs with the mariachi musicians who had come. The guests took turns approaching her bed to pay their respects, kiss her hand, or have a conversation. Among the paintings hanging on the walls, including her most candid self-portraits, the centerpiece of the composition was her own live performance, a body ravaged by illness yet full of indomitable spirit. Diego Rivera, who was present at the exhibition, could barely hold back his tears. Later, he would say that this evening was one of the greatest days in the history of Mexican culture. The exhibition was a tremendous success and lasted longer than planned, but Frida herself could no longer attend it. Just a few months later, in August 1953, due to gangrene, her right leg was amputated below the knee. This plunged her into a deep depression. It was a devastating blow, after which, according to those close to her, Frida's will to live began to fade. She was tired of fighting with her own body, tired of losing parts of herself, parts of her dream, growing further and further away from her ideal image of herself. She writes in her diary, and I hope I won't get blocked for this, but I think it's important to tell you about it. They amputated my leg 6 months ago. They subjected me to 1,000 torments and I almost lost my mind. I still want to end my life. Only Diego is holding me back. But I have never suffered more in my life. I will wait a little longer. In April 1954, Frida took a dangerous dose of painkillers and was rushed to the hospital. Diego Rivera and her caregivers managed to save her, but it was a clear signal. A month before her death, she was hospitalized again after taking a dose of painkillers. On July 13, 1954, Frida Kahlo passed away in the Blue House from pneumonia, or, as many biographers suggest, from an overdose of painkillers. However, no autopsy was performed, so we will never know the real cause of death, and I won't speculate about it here. The exhibition with the bed in April 1953 became exactly what Frida herself intended it to be. A great final act, a grand and fearless farewell to the public on her own terms. Her farewell took place at the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. In the very building where decades earlier Vasconcelos had invited muralists to paint the walls. The President of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, was present at the ceremony, the very same man who once gave refuge to Trotsky. Since 1958, the Blue House has become a museum in her memory, and today it is one of the most visited museums in Mexico City. Frida Kahlo lived only 47 years, nearly 30 of which were spent in constant physical pain that began with that very trolley bus accident. But it was precisely from this pain, from her broken body, from the inability to have children, from her husband's infidelities, from her own affairs, from the Tijuana costume as a political gesture, from the label of surrealist which she rejected, that one of the most honest and recognizable pictorial biographies of the 20th century was born. These are paintings that cannot be understood without understanding Frida's life, and once you become familiar with her pain, it is impossible not to love them. Frida Kahlo's paintings, as I think you already understand, cannot be judged from a technical point of view. Everything here is quite prosaic, but the meanings she put into them are truly unique. The life she lived is truly inspiring, and the pain she endured is truly touching. But she was not a victim. She was a woman who, in a country where a woman was supposed to be just a companion, chose to be the sun. In 2025, Frida Kahlo's painting, The Dream, The Bed, was sold at auction for an astronomical $54.7 million. And thus, she became the most expensive female artist in history. For comparison, the most expensive painting by Diego Rivera right now is the canvas The Dance in Tehuantepec, which was sold for $15.7 million. That's almost 4 times cheaper. The painting, The Dream, The Bed, was created in 1940 during her divorce from Diego Rivera, the death of Leon Trotsky, and her severe physical pain. The Dream was one of the rare important works by Frida that was in a private collection outside of Mexico, where her work is considered national patrimony and cannot be exported. And now, knowing everything I've told you about Frida, let's take a closer look at this painting, and you'll see how its symbolism will unfold before you. On the canvas, The Dream, the painting depicts Frida herself sleeping in the very same canopy bed that she arrived at the exhibition in and which floats in the clouds of a dream. On the canopy of the bed, right above the sleeping Frida, lies a giant skeleton. This is a traditional Mexican figure of Judas, which is made from papier-mâché and blown up with firecrackers during Holy Week on Holy Saturday. The skeleton, a symbol of death and pain, lies in the same position as Frida, as if living alongside her. His legs, wrapped in dynamite, are ready to explode at any moment, and in his hands he holds flowers as a paradoxical symbol of rebirth and life. Frida herself is also entwined with flowers, but for her, they keep her in bed, binding her to this strange and explosive coexistence of two sleeping entities. One is full of life, the other is the sister of death. But we don't know which is which. You have to admit, you can only understand this painting if you know everything about Frida's life. Frida Kahlo's art became not just an amazing story. For the first time, it was told so honestly and openly by a woman artist. It paved the way for many women, and men too, and inspired them not to be afraid to talk about their pain. Through their paintings, through their books, through their emotions, they tell us that we are not alone. Goodbye, everyone. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project where I need to build an interesting narrative, sometimes select up to 500 photos, arrange them correctly, and add captions. It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity. I'll keep doing this, but your support would really help me. Please become a sponsor of the channel here on YouTube, or even sign up for even the smallest subscription on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you. I'll leave the subtitles creator in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you for watching.